Okay, welcome to the final installation of the Social Media Profit and Protection series. I am Susie Babka, and I am so honored for all of our speakers, but really honored to have with us today Antonieta Mercado of the Communications Department and Aziz Muqaddam. Did I say it, Muqaddam? Please correct me, please. And so of the Communications Department. And I'm just really excited for their presentations today. So Dr. Mercado joined our staff in 2012 and teaches classes in media and conflict, teaches classes in international media, media and social movements in Latin America and the Latinx world. She studies transnational citizenship practices of communication among indigenous peoples and migrants. And so what she's done is some amazing presentations for the Humanities Center. She's a great friend of the Humanities Center, and I'm so grateful that she's here today. I could tell you all the journal publications. If you go to the website, there are a whole slew of them. She's also a volunteer for the Indigenous Front of Binational Organizations in Chicago and in San Diego, organizing media literacy workshops. She worked as a press and information officer at the Mexican consulate in San Diego, and also as a journalist for several years, writing articles for different newspapers. And so those are mainly Spanish language newspapers, La Opinión, Hoy, and Reforma. Dr. Muqaddam has recently joined us in the Department of Communication Studies. He teaches strategic communications and social media, is active in research and course development projects. His research draws from multiple fields: media studies, evolutionary psychology, marketing, and media design. His current research project centers on how status seeking affects charitable behavior offline and online, and how to strategically convert virtual connections into real life transactions. His expertise covers aspects of influencer marketing, personal branding, luxury brands, social media analytics, body image, online dating, and strategic visual communication. He's worked on projects in the domains of fashion marketing, food and restaurant services, nonprofit development, decision support systems, and educational outreach and training. So I just wanted to welcome welcome our speakers today. So can we?
Thank you for having us today. It's a real pleasure to have this conversation, to share this conversation we have had over several weeks with you. And our purpose is to make it more informal. So we'll just give you some basic framework that we have, and we title this presentation "Community Responses to Social Media in the Global South, Resistance and Counter-Resistance." So, you want to start?
Yeah, I would start. So probably all of you, when you think about social media is trying to change the world, right? Everyone wants to change the world. Social media is a force for good because we get more communication between countries, across countries, opportunities for businesses, for political change, for social changes, for education, whether we're talking about Twitter or Facebook, the TikTok now, WhatsApp, connecting people from different parts of the world actually that can communicate easily and accessibly, right? So that has been, how we shall say, the perception about social media, of course, good. But then the question that we're asking today, and actually have been discussing for the last 4 weeks, is that how true that statement is.
Okay.
Yeah.
It works.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was stuff on the Zoom.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's what it looked like.
Thank you. So should I move this?
Yeah, and so we gotta present two views there of what like how to understand the role of social media like this society. So yeah. So the first one is basically something called technological determinism. So this is like a conception that by the very nature of new technologies, new changes would occur, right? So the fact is, for example, the introduction of, let's say, radio and railroads in the 19th century, early 20th century, gave birth to certain social changes that was the progressive era in the United States. And the argument then, the new media or the new technology at that time, that was the social media that you can send signals to different parts of the country, right, would lead to more connectivity. And then would give room for the creation and emergence of social movements across different states. And we hear, we probably heard a version of this at some point when we're talking about the internet and social media. As someone from the last century, I remember I'm not old, but I'm old enough to remember the days about the internet as the democratization of information, probably with that phrase. And the idea is that, yes, technologies are sort of like autonomous agents. It's not really about the individuals working within the technology. It's just like the sheer volume of technological changes would necessitate or determine the social changes that would occur in a society. So that's the first view.
I guess I'm gonna talk about the second view. Another view, thank you, Aziz. I am well into the 20th century. I remember all these views, right? And determinism is usually a view that we hear a lot, the media. I mean, whenever there is a new technology, there is this fear that there's going to be some effect of the technology. But the truth is that it's more complicated than that. And this is another view of technology is social constructionism, right? That technologies are used as we use other things, right? If we gossip, for example, and if we have simplistic conversations in person, we'll gossip and have simplistic conversations online, right? And we will use the new technologies to adjust in some ways to our culture, to our views, right? Another thing that was very common when the internet was coming about was, in the 90s, there was all this hope, especially among social movements. I come from Mexico and Latin America, right? We had a movement, the Zapatista movement on the internet. They had a website even before the Mexican government had a website. And I'm talking about indigenous people who live in the south of Mexico, part of the high mountain and the jungle, La Selva Lacandona. And they spoke different dialects of the Mayan language, right? And they were able to communicate through the internet. So there was all this hope that the internet at that time, I'm talking about 1994, when the Zapatista movement happened, it was going to transform the reality. But in reality, it is more complex, right? And that's what we often talk about. I'm changing my view here, but I'm not changing that for you. So these are some of the very hopeful things, and I usually talk about this in my international media class. These movements, right? A lot of the movements touch on have become global because of the internet and because most recently because of social media, which is the latest iteration of the internet. And this is the Zapatista movement, right? They were very savvy in their communication and they were very tuned with the new medium that was the internet, right? That was available. And there have been other movements from, especially the ones against police brutality. I am showing you here, this appear as a hashtag, Ayotzinapa, Palestina, Ferguson, my barrio, tu barrio. it appeared on social media in 2014. It is linking, it was before Black Lives Matter became labeled that way, right, on social media. And it was linking police brutality against indigenous students in Mexico with police brutality against especially Black men and Black people in the United States. It was linking that, and it was linking anti-colonial movements in Palestine. Ayotzinapa is where, in Guerrero, Mexico, is where 43 students were disappeared by the Mexican military, basically. They were kidnapped and they disappeared. And you see the movements started to be linked together on the internet, on blogs, on the blogosphere, and then immediately on social media. This is Alicia Garza, who is one of the three organizers of Black Lives Matter. She posted in 2013 that after the verdict again about Trayvon Martin, right, when they exonerated the person who killed him, she said, Black people, I love you, I love us, our lives matter. And that's how it started, the label, that's how Black Lives Matter started to be named online, but with a connection to the streets, right? And then we see Black Lives Matter has become a transnational social movement with chapters in the UK, in South Africa. Is linked to police brutality and to abuses of the authorities against indigenous people, against colonized subjects, right? Black people. So these anti-colonial movements, for these movements, social media has been fantastic, right? It has been sort of and I wanted to show you, this is something that very often is shown when we start praising social media, the Arab Spring, right? It was one of the most important transnational movements. This is how the Tahrir Square looked like in Egypt during the Hosni Mubarak dictatorship, right? This is a public square, and there has been plenty of theorizations, even Judith Butler and other very, very famous theorists have been talking about the importance of the movement against Hosni Mubarak started to happen on Facebook. And then people got together, people called each other on Facebook, and they constructed these networks, and then they took these, I mean, this is before, it was barricaded by the government, right? This is the center, and people basically took public space, and that created so much hope on social media. It was a hopeful moment, right, in the world, 2011, 2012. And then in the United States, this happened in the spring, and then in the 2011, in the United States in September, we had something very similar. The social media helped in organizing people who went to take Zuccotti Park, right, in New York, and they started this movement called Occupy Wall Street movement, which was to bring attention to the concentration of wealth on the 1%, right? If you remember, the 1% is because of these very, very important. So those are some of the reasons, right? This is another international movement.
Yeah, and even in Ukraine, so we're going back to like a more relevant, like something that's happening. Still, we're having the ramifications. Oh, sorry. So, like something we still live in the ramification with, like the Euromaidan movement in Ukraine, which was about to topple. At the time, the Russian-backed president, and so in Ukraine actually in 2009, sort of like it was so complicated, but it was also like some maneuvering, and the Democratic elected president was like ousted, and new president was elected, but when Russia came in, put some opposition leaders in jail, and what was promising to have a more balanced approach was actually that they would still rejoin the European Union, but will still have a good relationship with Russia. At the time, people, after they saw what happened with the Arab Spring, And they were seeing that actually the president was going in the other direction. They were becoming more like Russia, as a matter of fact, more like Putin's regime. So they started like, they came back to the street basically. And it was like a highly digitized revolution. The same technique that we're using hashtags. There's one hashtag, here's a place, here's a time, done. Then you would just see each other in the streets. There's no need to build like a network for creating like a movement or like a official opposition. And that was super successful when replicating the upstream experiment in Ukraine and toppling the pro-Putin president then quickly, like within a matter of weeks, right? So whatever we just presented, this is what we call the utopian view of social media, or like the era of good feelings about social media, like hopeful like understanding, right? So, now we have this tool, people could organize easily, people could reflect change, and it's like a strong force, no one can stop it, it's tool for liberation, we can have, as Antonieta was saying, international movements without the need to physically go anywhere or like to build cross-border organizations. All of these is like, okay, the democratization would then, in the 20th century, would accelerate without the need for much of like material changes, right? And that's sort of the idea of big utopians. However, what happened after 2013? So one example of that will have happened to Syria. So they had a movement, they had protests in 2011, 2012. Pretty much that descended into like a brutal civil war, like suppression by the regime there, very brutally, with help from, well, actually different governments from Russia and other places. And it led to the largest displacement of people since World War II, as a matter of fact. So half of the population left the country, and around another quarter were like internally displaced. Strong devastation. Social media in itself was also part of the tools, both that the opposition has used and the regime has used, right? In recruiting people, in tracking people, and in finding locations for where to attack, right? Similarly,
Thank you. This was my colleague idea, the Empire Strike Back, and I agree. It was, I mean, as he said, there were a lot of apologists of the Arab Spring and the connection between social media and the Arab Spring, but a lot of defenders enthusiastic. They were very enthusiastic about that, but usually Syria was not mentioned because it was from the very beginning. It didn't follow the same path as Egypt or Tunisia or other Arab Spring countries. Similarly, in Mexico, with the beginning of the war on drugs in 2007, there was this phenomenon. The no longer the access was easier for social actors because they were already organized in networks, right? Little units here and there, and they will come together and lead the conversation. But then government actors and organized crime actors started to step in. And in a very ugly way, I remember as a Mexican citizen, I'm worried, my family lives there, there was all this violence that started to happen, and the media stopped reporting on the violence in many places. I went to Twitter, but Twitter became I never had learned that robots existed like in mass until somebody in Twitter, I was getting into a vitriolic exchange with somebody there. I left Twitter around that time, and somebody told me, don't pay attention, those are bots from the government. And that was 2013, that was early. And that was so new for me, right? It was, wow, what is that, right? And they actually started to hire, many places that were like did a strategic communication. They started to go into the business of producing bots for governments and selling them to harass activists and people online. So that was one of the reasons I left Twitter. I'm coming back to Twitter. I know it's a very important tool and you have to be there in some ways, but it was used. I mean, the Mexican government used bots, at least the Peña Nieto, since the Peña Nieto administration in 2012, 2018. And in the 2018 election, a lot of the discussions became intervened by police for hire. And this is something common. Government and more powerful actors than social movement leaders are getting into the discussion. This is sort of the dark side of social media, right? That this is what happens, what is happening, and this is where we're getting the solution about the potentials for liberation on social media. Some violent actors are also coming in. The cartels were hiring bots to harass journalists. So
yeah, and the same thing that also happened in Ukraine. So early on, just right after the president of Ukraine, like basically the country, materially there was like a full invasion of Russia into Crimea that happened really quick, and was accompanied also by a digital invasion. So pretty much using the same techniques of like bots and network analysis to flood basically the hashtags that are talking about the protest in Ukraine and just try to change your narrative to have like a more pro-Russian narrative. So whatever you want to get like some facts, you're actually getting most of the content from government-sponsored bots. And so it created this sort of like confusion in the world public, and not what you see today, so, which is an interesting contrast. But at the time, there was like people not understanding what's happening. It's happened real quick. There's like so much information out there. You go online, you cannot really find some useful information. So that was actually then again the idea of you can do your own social media and you can do your own movement in social media, but strong actors with more material logistics will be able to crush it, sometimes quite literally.
Yes, this is actually an interesting take. There's plenty of studies when the more social media outreach and penetration happens in a country or in a society, the more the tendency to radicalize the public speech, the public discourse. And there are several reasons, right? There is too much specialization and too much management of information. The social media platforms also operate under very different models, business models. We become the user, becomes the product, and they have this mining mentality, right? And even any kind of radicalization, violence, revolution is marketed back to the groups. So you get more radicalized. The more you get into an idea, you get more of the same idea, right? And then you start, that's where the algorithms start to play a very big role here. And the algorithms are also, if you go back to constructionism and determinism, usually the media paint algorithms as this fateful thing that happens to us, right? You go into social media, you get radicalized, you get separated, you get individualistic discussion. But algorithms are programmed by programmers, by people in those companies, right? And we can actually ask for accountability on those companies. And that's one of the things that need to happen. And many people, you're probably familiar with the Facebook whistleblower, right? Frances Kagan. She's advocating, she's constructing her website now, and I think she's advocating for that, for transparency of algorithms, and I think that's where the next level of activism can be. Pressure those companies to be less focused on mining our information. It's a very colonial model if you think about it. We are basically mined for information, anything we put out there. That's how they program the algorithms, and that's the business model. But we can actually, as citizens, we can actually ask the government to regulate how those algorithms get programmed. But you can see internationally, you see how it has, it has given place to espionage. For example, in China, the Chinese Communist Party has a whole unit in the party, that the propaganda unit, right, that monitors through social media the citizens and the conversations of the citizens. And one thing that is very clear that people say in China, that you can have conversations on social media, but if you say that you're going to meet somewhere, is when you get the officer from the party inviting you out for something, right? You get the threat from the government. So it is this system that is, the same system allows those actors that are powerful to monitor the citizens. And also extremist groups like revolutionaries, insurgent groups, organized crime in the case of Latin America. So I will move to the next.
Yeah. So the idea, like at the end of our point, that the idea, like the other side won't wait with them that have more resources, won't wait for social media to materialize into something that can upset the status quo of power, right? And so this gives into try to into consideration how we think about this idea of social media utopianism and why many things have failed, right? Like why this, and even if we go back to what you mentioned, Egypt and Tunisia, but the same came back pretty much in every other movements. Even if you think of the United States, whatever happened to Occupy Wall Street, even for Black Lives Matter, if you think of it, not a single piece of legislation has been passed to address the violence and police brutality, at least at the federal level, right? And the process has been happening since 2014. So what's in there? And so one media style like Sina Tofici from the University of North Carolina has actually a thesis about that. Why does what she called the networked prophets, why does social media or social mediated movements fail? And for the idea that is okay, social network side and social media, your Twitter, your Facebook, allow for the emergence of spontaneous campaigns, right? We saw many examples of that. Just posting a hashtag, we're going to protest in front of that building, that time and location, people show up, there's no central leadership, right? And this sort of headless nature, quote unquote, and it was sometimes even celebrated that, well, there are no gatekeepers, right? Anyone can join. There's no need to have infrastructure. And actually, if we don't have leaders, it's better because the leaders cannot be caught, because if the leaders caught, the whole network would be exposed and it would be crushed. But since there's no leaders, this movement can have a life of its own, right? That's the idea. However, because they don't have hierarchies and because they happen spontaneously, they fail to produce efficient or genuine leaders who could then articulate the vision of the movement and then work into establishing and having actual material gains. So for example, if you think about the civil rights movement in the United States, that took a long time actually to grow. That didn't happen 1963, or in somewhere they were a hashtag Selma. it was actually when we started from really from the grassroots, small pockets here and there, educational centers, activists, black journalists in local churches. But that experience of doing things little by little gave emergence to strong leaders to emerge, people with experience, like Martin Luther King, right? John Lewis, like people who have been actually talk the talk and walk the walk, and they say, know resources, know how the government works, know how Congress works, know about the dynamics, know about the power structure, right? So then contrast that with movement that didn't go through that experience. You fail to have leaders, you fail to have a strategic plan or strategic vision. Then you reach what we call like a tactical freeze. You only know how to post a hashtag and show up and raise your voice. You don't know how to do the other stuff, the boring stuff related to change, right? Hence, those movements tend to fail and becoming durable social forces, right? And so it was then the other counter forces that are actually organized, like governments, like big businesses, like cartels, like extremist group, could come in, copy your blueprint, but then just do it more efficiently. And so that's where you get.
Yeah, that's, I mean, one of the things that I always think about communication as scholarship, we started to study propaganda, and it's sort of coming full circle, right? It is, as Dr. Muqaddam said, it is important that there are all these networks with leaderless crowds online, but when we have more organized actors who are putting all this money and creating those, those conversations and affecting the conversations online, we have basically computational propaganda. And that has been a worrisome trend, right? It is basically propaganda for hire or communication for hire and followers for hire. We have seen that even on Instagram and other platforms. And the big, what suffers with all this cacophony is trust. We stop trusting each other because there is a devaluation of public discourse, right? We start distrusting authorities because we know that they are there to deceive us, right? That they are investing all this money, all these resources to manufacture those messages. So we started distrusting each other in the long run. That's a big consequence of these of the divisions and the devaluation of discourse, right? That some authorities that were trusted before are no longer trusted. I ran some of the, I think some of those posters. I'm missing the name right now, but some of those posters ran every year. Students your age, right? What do you trust? And usually you're trusting government less, and you're trusting your peers more, and you're trusting teachers are being distrusted now. And it is the erosion of epistemic authority, right? That's what's happening with this kind of interaction. So what you were saying is the social media counter revolution.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and pretty much like that's what you would see then at the political revolution for like disinformation campaigns by different governments, foreign intervention, hashtag unrelated, populist movements, and extremist groups have also used social media pretty effectively, actually, locally and internationally. Not to mention the whole dark web of misogynistic, like Reddit or subreddits groups, for example, and like different extreme right populist movements in different countries, so in Brazil, so in the Philippines, people also using the same tools to organize and big change in their own way, right?
Yes.
Pretty much.
We can pretty much just move. This is probably, we know this is the most well-known case, right, on cyber interventions abroad. A couple of years ago, there was, before the pandemic, Russia's unit on the Internet Research Agency, LabSet in Russia, had intervened about 27 elections in different countries, not only in the United States, but in other countries in the world, among them Brazil. So this is one of the possibilities that is happening, right? One of the things that is happening. A powerful actor, as in this case, Vladimir Putin in Russia, is organizing this unit. He distrusted that when he called the internet a CIA project, and for the longest time, Russia didn't have a formal internet project until about 2003, when this agency was created, and they created those Russian troll armies. You know, they have been, I mean, this is sort of well known, right? This is one of the most salient things that have happened. So you are.
So we want to like end with a more positive note. We're like, okay, is there anything good coming out of social media? And we actually think the answer is yes, absolutely. We've seen, for example, with the pandemic and in different countries around the world, actually, how social media has been actually used very effectively in preventive health measures. So, for example, distributing like where you get your mask or you get your vaccine or like you check your like testing. We've seen in different countries, rich countries, less rich countries, and developing countries, all of that, government using the resources becoming more efficient for communication because they are operating in the same digital space where the people are and can be used effectively across different languages. And so it had that opportunity, as a matter of fact, of improving the service and the communication between government agencies and the populace.
And finally, I mean, it's still the same groups that started in '94, right? Have also been using social media. I mean, a lot of indigenous groups and actors who might not have access to regular media are more and more becoming prominent in their blogs. I mean, one of the notorious cases that I often think about is Elvira Arellano, who you might think she was an undocumented immigrant from Mexico, and she was going to be deported, and she took refuge in a church in Chicago. And from there, for about a year and a half, she is through her Facebook page, she created her own narrative, right, about. And people were reporting on them, the media were reporting on her narrative because she posted her narrative. She was not very happy on the way the media covers immigration as heroes or criminals, right? But she constructed her own persona through her social media, and that's how. I mean, eventually she was deported, but she petitioned to be a refugee, and she's back in the States. So it is one of the cases when you see, well, there is some good coming out of it. The issue where the activism can go again is the algorithms and the companies, right? They are definitely for profit and they are making tons of money on us.
Yeah, and no, and just to add to that, but actually, if even with the algorithms, if you just go to social media right now and type in indigenous artists in San Diego, you will have better opportunity to find them really quick, right? Like because they're doing events, they have like the shops, people actually that show up a lot to and organize a lot of them herself. In a way unprecedented in any other point in history. And you won't be able, or you'd be hardly before the internet or before social media. It would have been really hard for you to find about those movements or those actors, let alone to join them, right? So finally, like just to conclude with a question for you, so then we turn the question back to you. Is there any good coming out of social media, right? You can, oh, you're a person. Yeah, that's a, yes, oh, no, can you go, no, no, the one, what do you think?
I think I missed it.
Yeah, another one, yeah, we can just, okay, you can just, we can just open the discussion, right?
Yeah, we wanted to open it.
Yeah, so yeah, we can add as like it's say like it can use by good movements, can use by governments. You can use it. We can use it. What's our role then to basically utilize it for the better outcomes? So I hope you enjoyed our little presentation. We'd like to hear your questions and comments.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Emphasize is to talk about the global south.
Mhm.
Mostly, I mean, we have plenty of examples in the US, but we wanted to talk about examples outside the US, particularly in the global south. So but we would like to hear from you. What do you think? How do you feel when you use social media? Most of you use social media, right? You have a TikTok account? What is the, you said you do, right? You have TikTok accounts?
So one thing that really sparked my interest in your presentations, which I thought was really marvelous, the whole thing about Arab Spring and all of this hope for all of this change, Occupy Wall Street, all of that. And you're right, it just petered out. And I think that saying that because these movements were so fast to form, they didn't get a chance to get that leadership. And so as someone who has been marching in protests my whole life and feels like at this stage of my life, I don't know if anything is really going to change in terms of the sort of corporate / colonial structure that just seems to not be able to move when it comes to the real change that needs to happen in people's lives, because they have the power, they have the money. And from what you're saying, they also have bots and manipulation that is able to do that. And so what do you think can be done in terms of Black Lives Matter had all that momentum and all of that possibility, and then it petered out, I think, because the Democrats were worried that saying that abolish police was too strong, and all those sorts of things. And so basically it got to the point where instead of being too radical, now we don't do anything. And so we're in this place where how can we take all of that good energy? Like, I remember how much hope I had during the Arab Spring, and how do you take that great energy without the whole thing of what happened during the civil rights movement? It was so great that what you pointed out was that it was organic. It was something that took grassroots people coming together, all of the different organizations that made up the civil rights movement. There wasn't just one, right? And so this is the thing. How do we get because you said that where it's really effective is when indigenous smaller groups are able to talk to each other and communicate. And so I'm wondering, is there a way that we can start to think about growing that leadership for that real change that all of these movements want, which is basically just more power in the people's hands, where they get to decide what happens, and then without the bot interference and all of that. So I was wondering, do we see any hope on the horizon for real activism besides just trying to get the algorithms different? I mean, is there a way that we can get to that?
I think I have to answer yes. It's so depressing when I say no. I think quite honestly, let me draw examples from like strategic communication course. Like I joke in my class about I would tell my students, you go to work for someone, and the employer would tell you, oh, we need to do social media. I said, what do you mean by need to do social media? Like, oh, we need to do like TikTok and Instagram. And like, what do you mean like we need to do TikTok? Like what's the vision? Like TikTok is just a platform, it's a tool, it's a venue. And you need to have a vision, okay, if I'm going to go to TikTok, what type of content we going to put there, and what are we trying to achieve by putting out that content, right? And it's the same thing, and it goes back to this idea of like social media as social construction. This is a platform, a tool, a very useful tool to be very effective in many situations, but it's not the real thing. It's not the goal. It's not the goal to get 1 million likes or 10 million mentions and a hashtag. That should be a channel by which you move to something else. And that's, I think, what the idea of like having visionary leaders is all about. Like actually forming organic groups, actually talking to one another in a meaningful way and not just exchanging things on Twitter. Finding out a plan, finding out a strategy, we're gonna achieve, like in this, you're gonna work with 1, 2, 3, these pieces of legislation, you're gonna push for them. But what you see, and I think this has to do with what social media incentivize is just empty, or like what you call like that's what slacktivism is. That's slacktivism, right? It's just like the idea if once I write down my hot take or take down of someone, I'm done. And the way to change that, I'm afraid to say, is just really the old school organizing, like just as maybe not marching like every day of your whole life, but no, like understanding the need to make genuine connection, understanding the need to be organized and to be patient, and just to learn from other successful examples that we relate, rather than trying to find some magical shortcuts. So, yeah, that's my.
Right-wing movements have been really successful in mobilizing hatred and communities of affect, right, of emotions. Whereas especially in the United States, many left-center movements have become more reformist and less inspirational. I think that's another issue, or like, bureaucratic, like, oh, we cannot do that now, just follow these steps. And that hasn't been good for many movements. I mean, it is the passion needs to be there, the vision, right? The platforms are just platforms. But something needs to be there. I think I honestly think that the Black Lives Matter movement, the internationalization of that movement and the conjunction, something that made me very hopeful was to see those statues toppled on the street and plenty. But they were not only the slave owners statues that were glorified in some parts of the South in the United States or in South Africa. They were conquistador statues. The people on the streets made that connection, right? Between colonized people have been suffering. And it was very clear. It was a connection that I didn't see on social media necessarily. I saw it coming from the streets, but I didn't see it on the activists' comments on social media, right? It's something more grassroots. And that's hopeful. It is an identification of the framework, right? It's colonialism and the whole, sometimes it is too big for us, right? We say, well, colonial structures are never going to be eradicated, right? But if you go to any indigenous activist group who are actually working for the colonizing themselves and the colonization, they have a strategy, they have a plan. It's not going to happen in a year. It's not going to happen in their lifetimes. But every push is important. So I think that's important, just to have the momentum. In the disillusionment, I think it came in the United States, we're talking about this, may I talk about this? I think you said specifically, that's very US centered. And I agree, but we were talking that the big disillusionment came with the Trump election in 2016, right? There was all this hope, and then Trump comes in, the populist movements around the world. Trump was not the first one, but he was certainly the more inspirational. Bolsonaro in Brazil calls himself the Trump of the tropics, and he says, make Brazil great again. I mean, basically, it's a copy, like a gross copy of Trump. But it was Erdogan in Turkey, and it was Duterte in the Philippines. And, you know, Narendra Modi in India. Putin himself, who fashioned himself as a Democrat for so many years, and he was entering the spaces, in, you know, the world spaces. Things like that. I mean, I think that's where the big disillusion. But we can go back to hope, and certainly with mobilization of affection, right? Affect, some passion. Yeah. Any other question? Any passions? Any comments? Well, I know it is most of the examples were pretty outside the United States, but if you have anything to say about the US, do you feel the same disillusionment in 2016? Probably not. But there is that distrust, right? On the public sphere.
And yeah, sorry.
Oh, I just had a question, and this is probably because I know Antonieta's work. But I'm kind of wondering, like, historically, you know, you've been studying communicative practices for a long time, looking at these social movements. So do you see, I guess, like in your early research, like, you know, late 1990s, when you're embedded in some of these indigenous communities and how they're using communication tools at that time, like cell phones, if there's like a thread of kind of common strategy that you have noticed over time, or is it now easier to do it because more people have access, or they've always been doing it kind of with new technology?
Social media and new technologies always were welcome, because the cheaper the technology is, the more accessible it is. Cell phones, for example, I mean, before when I started doing this work, it was the camcorders, right? They will record videos, and it was very transnational. Those movements were very transnational. They would send videos with people who will travel back to the communities from the States or from the cities if they were in Mexico. But now they're making videos with their cell phones, which is very welcome, right? They are doing storytelling. They're creating their in their social media platforms. They're creating their stories and in some ways managing the stories. The only thing about social media is it tends to be very individualizing, and I have seen that happening. I have seen the people who are more savvy to use social media tend to be, outstanding. And because it's communal organization, some people resent that because it's not communal. So I see that that's happening. That's a tension, right? Because the platforms glorify individuals versus communities. I see that as a tension because it's completely counterproductive to the community, right? But the conversations are still there, and they are using the tools. Absolutely. It is. It's a welcome tool. That's why I'm not super pessimistic. I mean, every time I talk to people in the movements, they are doing something very optimistic. They're doing something very engaging, and they have a vision. Maybe it's not in their lifetime, and this is a hard thing to communicate to students, right? Yeah. You want to inspire your students to take action, and you say, well, yes, there are concrete things that you can do, but then you have to make this a commitment. Change. And it's a lifetime commitment. So that's a hard thing to convey. But I see it in the community. Even for me, it was hard at the beginning I wanted to change things. Yeah. And it's like, you do more harm when you think you know what they mean. Yeah. than just sitting there and listening.
Yeah. It's part of that indigenous wisdom, that it doesn't have to be about me and my lifetime. It's about my children's children and what they would benefit from, that I think in our has to happen now culture in the States, it's just something that is hard to understand. And I'm wondering if the Black Lives Matter movement thought in terms more of that need for slow changes rather than saying abolish the police. And I actually carried a sign at one of the protests that said abolish the police. But at the time, there was obviously a lot of anger and a lot of that needed to get out. And so there's that. But abolish the police doesn't get us to really doing anything in terms of reform, because it sounds so extreme that it can't possibly affect any real change. And I think that's what happens, is we get so angry and we just want to do things and we just want things to change, and then you end up with all this energy that just kind of fizzles.
But I mean, that's the need, because even in there was no, and that's an issue I'm having when we're having this conversation about, oh, that was a mistake to say, let's say, police. But it was a mistake by who? Because there was no central committee that said, let's adopt this movement. It was just like started as a hashtag, and some people, because as you say, like hungry for fashion, started using it. But even at the time, if you're arguing, hey guys, this is counterproductive, who are you going to talk to? Like, the politician could distance themselves away from the slogan, but they don't control the narrative, right? Like, and he was saying, and you hear that like, oh, Democrats made a mistake by saying this or saying that. Well, they didn't actually say it, but those are like decentralized structures or movements, and once the narrative is out there, it's just like it has its own life. Back to the nature, the individualizing nature of social media, right? So, how to the point I'm trying to make is, you should have. I think the way it should be approached, like this is you're being part of a conversation, rather than you're making a list of demands or propositions. Getting into conversation, and that conversation will lead you into something more coherent that you can work on later. But yeah, I mean, whenever people are trying to think of, and I see this a lot, especially like in political communication, people still think that, they could control the narrative, or like they own the brand, or like what I could define, for example, what BLM is, or what, it's not abolish police, but like abolish ICE.
Yes,
that's as if something you could control, right? Oh, guys, this slogan doesn't work. Let's just, as if it's like a marketing campaign. But it's not the way. Like, you have different actors, they're having this conversation. You cannot tell them don't say that. You gotta engage in that conversation and hope for something more fruitful to come out of it. So,
Here's the abolish ICE.
Yeah, well, I think even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was saying that, actually saying that in speeches. And it was really more of how do we deal with organizations that have become so corrupt, right? That we don't know how to move forward. And I think that's part of the passion of it.
Yeah, definitely. We need really passion, really beautiful passion. I mean, it is, I'm very hopeful, because there is a lot of, at least on social media today, one of my friends who's an activist, there's a lot of art, poetry, and a lot of activism on the art side, murals and paintings, and different forms of media, right? I mean, even rituals, even Day of the Dead displays. And one activist said this morning, well, what's this colonization word everywhere? I see it everywhere. She's Zapotec, she has been a poet for a long time. She writes in Zapotec, in Spanish, and her poetry has been translated to English as well. Yeah, it is just bothered, because in a lot of the movements, they have been really talking about decolonization, and decolonization is also a critique against capitalism and against this very hyper-individualist society that we live in, how to foster solidarity and how to have conversations, practices of hearing as well, hearing others, acknowledging others. It was an interesting conversation we had because, yes, I mean, I ask my students all the time, have you heard the term decolonial? You have heard it, right? You're saying yes. It is out there, right? It is interesting that it's out there on social media. It is sort of free floating right now, isn't it? It is what is decolonial, right? You have heard that. All of you, all the students here are saying, yes, we have heard that. But when I ask you what it is, it's on social media, right? You have heard that on social media? Okay. Yeah, it's part of the conversation. I'm not super pessimistic. I know that a lot of things become fashionable, and that's part of the system that we live in. But if people hear that term, maybe there is a seed that people will explore what that is, right? So that's important. I always think that this generation has a different actor that we didn't have before, Mother Nature. Mother Nature is speaking very, and I think more than we adults, I think right? It is speaking. There is a big preoccupation with climate change, and in indigenous narratives, it's not only our community. Mother Nature is also part of the trees, the rivers, others, our ancestors. So that's sort of being part of the conversation. So in some ways, I'm not that cynical that social media is all about decolonization and sometimes it's fashionable because the market has that characteristic, right? It can co-opt revolution. Che Guevara is on those t-shirts. Right?
Already down t-shirts.
Pancho Villa, we have a market called Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa invaded the United States. He will be, if he invaded the United States now, he would be like a criminal, right? He invaded the United States. He came, one of the very few, like the only invasion, right, that the United States has had. Pancho Villa came in 1916 in Columbus, New Mexico, with the troops and invaded the United States. And there were deaths and there was a battle. Now it is an icon. I can buy a bunch of stickers and bags. And it's interesting, right? The market, how the moment that we're living in, everything can become a commodity. Every idea, everything. There is some hope also. Consumption also makes sense.
Yeah, definitely.
Any other? I know that it is. I mean, I feel like I'm in the classroom and I'm asking you questions, but maybe you feel a little bit intimidated. Any other thought that you might have? I know that you were asked by your professors to come on this class. Any thoughts that you might have?
Well, what concerns you?
Or concerns?
Yeah. What are you concerned about? We have the midterm elections coming up.
About that.
Are these concerns?
Okay, when you first started talking about social media and the idea of leaders, the first thing I thought about was Greta Thunberg, because she was an activist that was started on her own with Climate Fridays, and she walked out by herself because of like the mobilization of social media in Norway. I forget where she's from. Sweden. Yeah, Sweden. she was able to mobilize and get a lot of young people and actually get her voice heard in like model United Nations summits and be heard in the government. But kind of what you guys are saying is, I feel like this isn't like a diss to the older generations, but I do feel as though most of the time our generation is tasked with mobilizing and making all these movements. But when we're finally given a platform, it feels like empty seats we're speaking to. Because Greta Thunberg has time and time again been presenting what she's been fighting for years now, with little to no change done by world leaders. Even though she does have a very public support system with like every youth in the entire world where she got her voice heard, but there's very little change on social media. And when not kids, because we are all adults now, and Greta Thunberg is always referred to as a child, but she's 19 years old. She like is an adult. It feels like no one is listening to us, and we're treated as children. But at the same time, it's like a double-edged sword. They expect us to be the voice for the future, but our voices are sometimes muted. And that's why I was thinking a lot about when you mentioned like environmental change, like we are going to be the generation that experiences that. And it might be because we haven't like faced the political ramifications the older generation has of limiting carbon footprint, like gas prices and everything in fossil fuels. But there's just like all this pressure on students like us, I feel like, especially in social media, because everyone's always like, well, you use social media, right? You use it. And it's like, yes, but no one listens to us. So I think there is good. I am totally on the side that it's like a very beneficial platform. But I think when people say that I started a movement on Twitter, it doesn't sound as nice as I protested in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1969. So I think there has to be like a recentering of our conversation around social media and its benefits if we actually want to make a change.
I really like the comment though. One thing though, I think people, and this is just in general, people don't realize how changes in rhetoric and conversations are, right? And so the idea of like, we think like political changes are only one outcome. So can we say Greta didn't have any, or does not have, or did not make any effect? I would say no, she has been affected. Like just the part of like at the time she was I think 16-year-old giving a speech at the United Nations. That's quite something. That stirred that media coverage that got your attention, that got many young people attention around the world, started to read about climate change, started to read about the youth climate initiatives and all of that, started to follow the science, maybe started even to major in like things related to facing climate change. Those are important effects. And you can think, and I think this is part, like maybe it was neglected here because we had a limited time and it was like we had like a specific theme. But right, changes in conversations are important. When we start to think about police violence, even if people say stupid things or unrealistic things, but we are having the conversation. People are starting at least to think it. It's now part of the agenda setting. It's now part of the agenda. And at some point, you really cannot be muted, honestly, like because if people want to know you, other people will listen to you. And so that could have long-term effects. Yes, we cannot really like say it's a one-to-one, like a domino effect. It's more like what they call the butterfly effect. Like it's like a small changes in the water that later would have something. Like you didn't see the first movement, but it was because of that, right? So think about, for instance, right now, for instance, discussions about trans rights, right? Those are just discussions, but they are meaningful discussions. Like people are now thinking about it, people are changing their opinions. Now, being more considerate, people your generation, I mean, about how to talk and address others, how to appreciate the lifestyle they take and how they look and all of that. So yeah, I do believe then that organizing is one thing and it's necessary for like big societal changes, but changing in conversation is also important.
And for me, it is always hard to talk about the environmental movement, especially coming from Latin America. I don't know if you're aware that most of the activists who fight for the environment that have been killed are indigenous people from Latin America. And so it's not necessarily a generational discussion, although in the West it is. In the Western countries, who are the largest polluters on Earth, is sort of a generational. Greta Thunberg is sort of the spokesperson. But in the global South, people have been talking about this. Nature is sacred, and indigenous people have been saying this to conquerors, to Europeans, since Europeans set foot on this land. So it is, I think, something that needs to happen probably. Social media is those movements getting into conversation, right? Getting together, because there is more than generational change or generational awareness. Those conversations are happening, but it needs to be, they need to encounter themselves somewhere, right? The source. So that's why it's always complicated for me, right? To think. I mean, I have some specifically. I have one of my friends who was killed, and for protecting a river in Oaxaca, it's particularly painful, right? About it. About some trauma in our kids. And if you go back, I mean, if you think about the Western countries, the ones who pollute the most, you think about the companies that pollute the most, most of the companies belong to white men from Western countries. It's very sad.
Yeah, I'm from El Salvador, so I completely get the dynamic of the two Western and the South.
Yeah, the violence, right? We get into this, they're so violent, but violence is also comes from outside. Yeah. But it is very, very important to make this. Thank you. That's a good question. So good. Any other thoughts? Yeah. Maybe some seats, right? for thinking. Yeah, we need to do algorithm activism and
Yes.
and push for Facebook and those big companies business. I mean, they have no business of being monopolies.
To be honest with you, I don't think that's even necessary. Now, I do think this company think they are in principle, but they're not. Like, they could lose relevance real quick. And I do remember BlackBerry. You even remember BlackBerry, but like how big it was.
Yeah.
Or
And that
MySpace.
collapsed. Oh my God. But MySpace, MySpace didn't. MySpace never became like a big thing. It was the only thing probably at some point. But BlackBerry was huge. The devices and the network, even the chat, it was like, you could chat with anyone, anywhere, anytime. And it just collapsed in a year or two. Like just fell. Yeah, AOL was like one of the founders of the internet. Now it's mostly like a network company and they do like some boring stuff. But at least they're there. And so I don't think, I don't think Facebook is as in principle as they think they are. People would grow bored. People like those conversations actually about privacy and algorithms and all of that would eventually have its have their outcomes. Like people would change their behavior, and those companies would silence themselves in a hard place unless they change. Would basically wither away. And so I'm actually more optimistic in that regard.
Yeah. And nobody really, I mean, I don't think the metaverse is very exciting. Is it for you? For me, it's not, but I thought maybe I'm old and I don't get excited with Mark Zuckerberg's. Right?
Well, he wants to put everybody in a virtual universe.
Yes.
He wants everything to be virtual.
But we had something like that. Isn't it? We didn't have Second Life, Kristen.
Mhm.
Didn't we, in our early in our careers, when we trained in Second Life, we had avatars.
Yeah.
I mean,
We tried to meet in Second Life and then people come up to report it.
yes, you're right. You're right. So remember, social constructionism right, is more like, I mean, they don't determine who we are, those technologies, right? We use them as tools.
We have to talk about who we are.
Exactly.
So the conversations that you talked about and you talked about are so important to keep having a vision of what we care about and what we want to preserve. But thank you both so much. This has been wonderful.